They had survived the frozen rivers of Russia, the rolling barrages of the Red Army, the creeping fire of British 25-pounders, and the punishing storms of Soviet Katyusha rockets. Yet when German prisoners of war were questioned in Normandy, Brittany, the Hurtgen Forest, and the Ardennes, their answers were startlingly consistent. The weapon they feared most on the Western Front was not the Sherman tank, not the P-47 Thunderbolt, not the bazooka or flamethrower. It was the one weapon few American infantrymen ever saw up close, the one that lived miles behind the front lines, U.S. Army field artillery, a machine of coordination and mathematics and invisible destruction whose efficiency stunned even veteran Wehrmacht officers. And in the summer of 1944, as the hedgerows of Normandy echoed with the thunder of 105mm and 155mm guns, German soldiers began to understand that this artillery was unlike anything they had faced in the East or the Mediterranean. It struck too fast, too precisely, and too relentlessly to be compared with anything else in the war. This fear was not born from a single moment, but from countless encounters where German units found themselves pinned, shattered, or erased by American fire before they could even react. What they did not realize at first was that behind every American artillery strike, behind every perfectly timed salvo that landed as if the shells had been waiting overhead, was a system, a structure of communication and computation known as the Fire Direction Center, the beating brain of American firepower. To the Germans in the field, the effect felt supernatural. Shells rained down within minutes of first contact. When they shifted positions, the artillery followed. When they massed for counterattack, barrages materialized seemingly from thin air. A lieutenant of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, captured near Saint-Lô, said with disbelief, "Your guns arrive too fast. It is as if you see us before we move." What he did not realize was that in many cases, the Americans did see them before they moved, because floating silently above the hedgerows was the L-4 Grasshopper, a slow, unarmored observation plane that hovered over the battlefield like a watchful spirit. German soldiers quickly learned that the appearance of a spotter plane, barely audible and drifting at treetop level, meant death. "Der kleine Flieger," they whispered, "the little flyer." When the L-4 circled, artillery followed within 5 minutes, sometimes 3, sometimes faster. In the opening of the Normandy breakouts, these tiny aircraft, flown by artillery officers, not fighter pilots, corrected fire with a precision Wehrmacht forward observers could not match. They turned every American battalion's guns into a scalpel that cut through hedgerow defenses, one orchard at a time. But what truly broke German morale was the speed. No German artillery regiment could match the American reaction time because no other army had a centralized fire control system capable of turning dozens of guns into one synchronized weapon. When a U.S. infantry platoon needed fire, they called their artillery liaison. When that call reached the FDC, 8, 12, or 24 guns could be assigned instantly, each receiving exact sight settings calculated by slide rule, map grid, met data, and predicted trajectory. The Germans had no equivalent. Their system was decentralized, dependent on individual battery officers. American artillery was industrialized, standardized, mechanized, and crucially, wired into a communications network the Wehrmacht could not disrupt. One German captain captured after the battles near Mortain confessed that the single reason their counterattack collapsed was the volume and accuracy of American artillery. "We had tanks, we had courage, we had surprise, but within minutes your guns took all 3 from us." American infantrymen knew it too. They called their artillery the 4-minute killers. The Germans gave it harsher names: the steel rain, the ghost guns, the weapon that answered before we shot. Nowhere was this terror more vivid than in the hedgerow battles before Saint-Lô. German companies dug into sunken lanes, believed they were safe, until the L-4 spotted them and the FDC calculated a time-on-target strike that landed every shell at the same second. Survivors described the ground lifting beneath them, air turning solid with steel, and the realization that the Americans could turn any field, any copse of trees, any farmstead into a killing zone with only a short radio message. Yet the fear reached its peak later, after the Americans introduced a technological marvel the Germans had never seen. A shell that exploded without hitting the ground, a shell that sensed its target through radio waves, the proximity fuse. The Wehrmacht had no defense against it. German soldiers had learned to survive conventional artillery by finding cover, trees, dugouts, folds in the terrain. But proximity-fused shells ignored cover. They burst in the air, at the exact height to shred infantry with optimized fragmentation. There was no hiding from it, wrote a member of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division after the Ardennes. The air itself killed us. And so by the time the fighting moved toward the Siegfried Line, a grim realization had spread through German ranks. This was not an ordinary artillery arm. It was a system, an engine of calculation, observation, and massed fire that erased assaults, crushed counterattacks, and broke the will of even veteran formations. They had faced Soviet waves, British barrages, and Allied air power, but nothing matched the cold precision and terrifying speed of American artillery. In the minds of German soldiers, the Western Front had a singular king of death, and it did not crawl on tracks or roar from above. It sat quietly behind the lines, waited for coordinates, and spoke only in thunder. For months, German officers tried to understand how American artillery could react with such terrifying speed and accuracy. They believed at first that the Allies must have had more guns, or more ammunition, or perhaps shorter supply lines. None of those explanations came close to the truth. What set American artillery apart, the reason German soldiers feared it more than tanks, aircraft, or infantry, was not quantity. It was the system behind the guns, a system no other military on Earth possessed in 1944. The Fire Direction Center, or FDC, a centralized command network that transformed scattered batteries into a single coordinated weapon. And on the Western Front, this system turned the U.S. Army's artillery arm into the most lethal, responsive firepower organization of the entire Second World War. While Germany relied on battery-level fire control, each battery calculating its own trajectory, corrections, and firing solution, the Americans did something radically different. They concentrated all mathematical, geographic, and meteorological calculations into a dedicated brain, the FDC. Located behind the lines in a tent, truck, or commandeered French farmhouse, the FDC became the nerve center of destruction. When infantry called for help, the request did not trickle down through layers of bureaucracy or wait for local battery officers to interpret it. It went straight to the FDC, where trained fire direction specialists took in map grids, target descriptions, landmarks, enemy movement patterns, weather data, and wind drift, all within seconds, and produced firing data for every gun in range. This meant that American artillery could do something catastrophic for the Wehrmacht: mass fire instantly. 8 guns, 12 guns, 24 guns, even batteries from entirely different regiments could be ordered to fire at the same target with perfectly synchronized timing. The Germans had seen massed artillery before from the Soviets, but never with this magnitude of precision. The Red Army used volume. The Americans used accuracy multiplied by volume. The deadliest expression of this integration was the time-on-target mission, or TOT, a concept that German forward observers initially refused to believe was real. TOT required each gun to fire at different times so that all shells, regardless of their distance from the target, arrived simultaneously. For German troops, it felt as though the earth itself exploded beneath them without warning. There was no gradual buildup of shell fire, no first ranging shots to reveal the attack. One second, the battlefield was quiet. The next, hundreds of steel fragments tore through hedgerows, fields, and villages as if detonated by invisible command. American top missions at St. Lo were so devastating that POWs later recalled entire companies vanishing in under a minute. It was as though the sky had folded onto us, one infantryman of the 275th Regiment said. The FDC also made possible what German soldiers most dreaded, rapid fire shifts. In Normandy's hedgerow maze, German forces tried time and again to reposition, falling back a few hundred meters, taking new cover, reorganizing for a counterattack. But the moment an L-4 Grasshopper spotted movement and radioed new coordinates, the FDC issued updated firing solutions within minutes. American batteries did not need to re-register targets or recalibrate from scratch. Their mathematical groundwork was already done. The shift from one fire zone to another could be as fast as shifting gears in a vehicle. This speed crushed German attempts to maneuver. A veteran NCO of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division later stated, "Your artillery did not give us time to breathe. When we moved, it followed. When we stopped, it destroyed." But even more demoralizing was the consistency. The Wehrmacht, especially in 1944, suffered from chronic shortages in communications equipment and trained observers. American artillery, on the contrary, was woven together through a robust network of radios, landlines, relay centers, and forward observers attached to every infantry battalion. Every rifle platoon had a path to artillery support. Every company had an artillery liaison. Every battalion had its own FDC link. This meant German forces could never assume the Americans won't be able to reach us here. The Americans reached everywhere. On hilltops, in forests, behind ruined farmhouses, in the dark of night and fog of morning, their artillery was always within call. During Operation Lüttich at Mortain, this system reached its terrifying peak. The Germans launched a desperate counterattack with elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Panzerlehr Division, and 17th SS Panzer Grenadier with the goal of reaching Avranches and cutting Patton's supply corridor. The American 30th Infantry Division, outnumbered and facing elite armored forces, should have been annihilated. Instead, they held, and they held because of artillery. For 24 straight hours, the FDC coordinated fire from 105mm and 155mm batteries belonging to multiple divisions. The result was 17,000 rounds fired in a single day, smashing every German attempt to break through. Veteran panzer crews described the bombardment as a wall of iron. Fallschirmjäger units advancing through the mist never even saw the Americans. They were broken entirely by artillery fire. The Germans did not fear artillery because it was loud or destructive. They feared it because it was immediate, coordinated, intelligent, and unrelenting. They feared it because it worked faster than their doctrine, faster than their movement, faster than their ability to react. By mid-1944, commanders across the Wehrmacht grimly accepted the truth. American artillery wasn't just a supporting arm, it was the backbone of the U.S. Army, the silent king of the battlefield, the weapon that dictated when and how German forces could move and punished them mercilessly when they guessed wrong.
Before Normandy, German commanders believed, deeply, confidently, that their panzer formations could smash through anything the Americans put in front of them. They had done it in France in 1940, in the Balkans in the first months of Barbarossa, but in August 1944, in a quiet corner of northern France near a town few Americans had heard of, Mortain, that belief died under a storm of American artillery. The battle was supposed to be a German triumph. Hitler himself ordered it, demanding that the elite 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and remnants of Panzerlehr punch through thin American lines, reach Avranches, and split the Allied armies in two. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the traditional German edge in armored warfare. It never had a chance, not because the Americans outnumbered them, and not because the U.S. had more tanks, but because American artillery turned every German movement into a death sentence. It began on the morning of August 7, 1944. Fog blanketed the hills around Mortain. masking the German advance as Panthers and Panzergrenadiers surged forward. The initial shock hit scattered outposts of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, men who were awake not because they expected a German offensive, but because nothing slept easily in Normandy. When German armor erupted from the fog, the American riflemen did exactly what their doctrine demanded. They called for artillery. What happened next would echo in German prisoner interrogations for months. The request reached the fire direction centers within moments. Observers, both on the ground and in L-4 grasshoppers flying above the fog bank, relayed target grids. And then the sky opened. In a little more than 24 hours, American artillery fired 17,000 rounds, shattering German infantry battalions, destroying attack coordination, and forcing Panthers to halt under a storm of steel fragments that ripped antennas, periscopes, and exposed crew. One officer in the 2nd SS Panzer Division later said, "We could not form for attack. We could barely move. Every lane, every field, every hedgerow was under fire." The Germans had walked into a battlefield designed for American artillery. Short distances, clear lines of communication, trained observers everywhere, and an FDC system that allowed guns from different divisions to fire as a single organism. Infantry companies of the 30th Division, outnumbered and pressed by some of the best armored troops in the German army, survived because every time a German unit massed, a torrent of explosives hammered them flat. The artillery was so devastating that the 1st SS Battalion advancing their Hill 314 radioed back that they were taking casualties without ever seeing the Americans who were killing them. If Mortain broke the German belief that their armor could overwhelm American infantry, then Saint-Lô broke their belief that any fortified position was safe from U.S. firepower. Before Operation Cobra, German troops entrenched in the hedgerows believed they could hold indefinitely. Their defenses were strong, their machine guns well-sighted, and their Panzerfaust teams hidden. But they had not anticipated what American artillery, massive, precise, and controlled by air observers, could do to fixed positions. Beginning on July 19th and intensifying over the next week, American 105 and 155 mm batteries unleashed coordinated barrages to break German strongpoints one by one. L-4 grasshoppers orbited overhead, flying slow circles that German soldiers learned to dread. As soon as American infantry encountered resistance, they pulled back, called artillery, and waited. The FDC calculated corrections, and within minutes the hedgerow bunker, MG-42 nest, or concealed mortar pit was obliterated. By the time the Cobra bombardment officially began on July 25th, with heavy bombers cracking open the German line, the field artillery had already softened, shattered, or erased most German positions. After the breakout, a captured German officer from the 353rd Infantry Division told interrogators it was not your tanks that forced us out of Saint-Lô. It was your artillery. You always had it. Always. The battles of Mortain and Saint-Lô shared one defining lesson for the Wehrmacht. Once American artillery found you, you were finished. Moving drew fire. Staying still drew fire. Retreating drew fire. Gathering for counterattack invited annihilation. Nothing in German doctrine, rooted in maneuver, speed, and aggressive assault, could survive the mathematics-driven tempo of American fire support. But the true shock came when the Germans realized that Normandy was not a unique situation. What they had experienced there, constant, crushing artillery, would follow them into Brittany, across the Seine, and straight into the Ardennes. Even as their armies retreated, the weapon they feared most pursued them relentlessly. The Americans didn't have the fastest tanks, nor the deadliest infantry rifles, nor the most armored half-tracks, but they had the most responsive artillery system the world had ever seen. And at Mortain and Saint-Lô, for the first time, the Wehrmacht understood what that truly meant. Their chance of regaining the initiative on the Western Front had died under American shells.
By December 1944, German troops had learned to respect American artillery. In the forests of Hürtgen and the plains of Lorraine, they had already tasted the speed and crushing weight of U.S. fire missions. But nothing prepared them for what awaited in the Ardennes. Hitler's last offensive, the surprise attack meant to split the Allied lines, crush the American First Army, and force a negotiated peace. The Germans believed they had the advantage of terrain, weather, and experience. What they did not know was that the Americans were about to unleash the deadliest artillery innovation of the entire war, the proximity fuse. And in the bitter cold of the Ardennes, that invention would transform U.S. guns into the most terrifying weapon German troops had ever faced. The offensive began on December 16th, under cover of fog and snow. German Volksgrenadier divisions surged through the forest, supported by Panzer IVs, Panthers, and assault guns. American infantry units, scattered and under strength, fell back under the weight of the assault. To German commanders, it seemed for a moment that history might repeat itself, that a sudden, powerful strike could break the front, as in 1940. But within hours, their hopes collided with a reality they had not anticipated. American artillery, though disorganized at first, recovered with stunning speed. And when it did, it struck with a lethality no previous German assault had ever endured. The key was the VT fuse, a marvel of scientific miniaturization that allowed a shell to detonate when it came within a precise distance of a target, usually between 20 and 40 feet above ground. Instead of exploding harmlessly in the soil, the shell burst in mid-air, sending deadly fragments outward in a wide cone. German foxholes that would have protected them from a ground burst now became traps, offering no refuge from the rain of steel. At places like Wallerscheid, Rocherath, Krinkelt, and Elsenborn Ridge, the effect was catastrophic. A soldier of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, one of the units spearheading the assault, later stated in interrogation, it was as if the air itself shattered. Another POW described the experience. We hid from tanks, we hid from aircraft, but we could not hide from this. On Elsenborn Ridge, where American forces formed one of the few stable defensive lines in the northern sector of the Bulge, artillery became the immovable wall that stopped repeated German assaults. The U.S. 5th Corps artillery fired so many missions that the Germans assumed there must be multiple divisions present. In reality, it was the same FDC-driven system that had dominated Normandy. Centralized control, fast communications, and massed fires. Whenever the Germans attempted to form up for an assault, L4 spotters, operating just behind the ridge or from hidden clearings, observed them through the breaks in the forest canopy. The moment a formation was detected, even a small group of infantry, coordinates were sent to the FDC. The proximity-fused shells shattered German units before they could advance 100 meters. The most shocking episodes occurred when German troops attempted to infiltrate under cover of night. They believed darkness would protect them. They were wrong. Unlike ground-burst shells, which produced visible impacts, VT shells produced mid-air flashes that illuminated the forest in brief, terrifying bursts. German survivors described it as lightning that kills. Meanwhile, American fire direction centers demonstrated the same blistering reaction time they had shown at Mortain. Even though the Germans achieved operational surprise at the beginning of the offensive, U.S. artillery quickly re-established communication nets and began delivering fire missions measured in minutes, not hours. When the 2nd SS Panzer Division attempted to break through near Krinkelt, American artillery shattered their supporting infantry before the tanks could close. Panthers arrived at the front without the grenadiers they needed to seize the village and were forced to withdraw under fire from bazookas and anti-tank guns. In the southern sector, the story repeated itself. Near Bastogne, German panzer divisions surrounded the 101st Airborne, confident that artillery and armor superiority would eventually crack the ring. But the U.S. artillery battalions attached to the 101st, firing from dug-in positions, delivered concentrated barrages that broke German attacks day after day. When the 26th Volksgrenadier Division attempted to storm the perimeter on December 23rd, a single, coordinated TOT mission annihilated entire companies. The Germans learned the hard way that American artillery did not require clear weather, air superiority, or large troop concentrations. It required only a map, a radio, and a few seconds for the FDC to compute firing data. By early January, German momentum had collapsed. Their units were depleted not just by infantry and tank losses, but artillery casualties that reached levels unseen in previous Western Front battles. POWs consistently remarked that it was artillery, not tanks, not aircraft, not infantry, that had broken their offensive. General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's best armored commanders, admitted after the war that the proximity fuse alone had decisively influenced the failure of our attack. The Battle of the Bulge was the Wehrmacht's last major offensive, and it failed not because the Americans had more tanks or better weather or stronger defensive lines, but because their artillery had evolved into a weapon that rendered German tactics obsolete. Maneuver warfare could not succeed when every movement triggered instant destruction. Massed infantry attacks could not succeed when the air above them exploded. Surprise could not succeed when L4 spotters and FDC networks erased the advantage within hours. In the frozen silence of the Ardennes, as German units withdrew through snow-covered forests, littered with burned-out vehicles and shattered trees, they carried with them a final grim realization. American artillery had become the dominant force on the battlefield, a weapon that made every hill, road, and village a potential killing ground. And as long as it remained intact, Germany's hopes of victory on the Western Front were gone forever.
In the final months of the war, as shattered German divisions retreated across the Rhine, and the once proud Wehrmacht dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance, American interrogators kept hearing the same confession repeated by prisoners of every rank, from young Volksgrenadiers to officers who had once served in Russia or North Africa. Your artillery was the most terrifying weapon we faced. It was not said with bitterness, nor flattery, but with the exhausted honesty of men who had been hunted by a force they could never outrun or outthink. And when the U.S. Army later compiled these interviews into intelligence reports, a striking conclusion emerged. The Germans feared American artillery more than Sherman tanks, more than P-47 Thunderbolts, more than naval gunfire or small arms, because American artillery took away the one thing the Wehrmacht had always relied on: freedom of movement. German doctrine, from blitzkrieg to elastic defense, depended on speed, initiative, and small unit aggression. Their infantry and armor excelled at infiltration, maneuver, and rapid exploitation. But none of that mattered when every attempt to mass forces, counterattack, or even withdraw triggered an instant rain of steel delivered with mathematical precision. American artillery did not merely kill soldiers, it controlled the battlefield, dictating when and how German forces could move, react, or survive. The core of this dominance came from three pillars the Wehrmacht never ratched: the Fire Direction Center, the L4 spotter system, and the proximity fuse. The FDC turned dispersed batteries into a unified weapon. The L4 provided persistent, unblinking eyes above the battlefield, and the proximity fuse delivered a type of lethal overpressure and fragmentation that no amount of training or bravery could overcome. A German captain from the 560th Volksgrenadier Division summarized the feeling best. Against your tanks, we had tactics. Against your infantry, we had courage. Against your artillery, we had nothing. What stunned German officers most was not just the technology, it was the efficiency. American artillery units could emplace and fire within minutes of arriving at a location. Communications networks allowed fire missions to be passed seamlessly across units. Truck mobility meant that American guns could leapfrog forward,
maintaining constant pressure on retreating German forces. Even in chaotic environments, Normandy's hedgerows, the fog-choked Ardennes, the Siegfried Line forests, the artillery never seemed to lose contact. We were always under observation, one German major recalled. Even when we saw no planes, no enemy positions, no patrols, the guns found us. Part of this impression came from the L-4 Grasshoppers, the unassuming aircraft that became one of the most hated symbols of American firepower. German soldiers described them as demons, ghosts, and the little curse. Their slow, drifting movement made them almost impossible to hit with small arms, and their ability to loiter for hours meant that once they spotted a German formation, whether a platoon in open ground or a column of Panthers concealed beneath trees, destruction followed with chilling reliability. Added to this was the psychological devastation of the proximity fuse. German troops who were survived Russian artillery or British 25-pounders were not prepared for shells that detonated in the air, shredding everything below with razor-sharp fragments. Foxholes that once provided safety became death traps. Forest cover, normally a shield, became a killing zone where tree bursts multiplied the fragments. In the Ardennes, German units reported that proximity artillery caused casualties at rates 2 to 3 times higher than ground-burst shells. It came from above, a soldier from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division said, and it followed us wherever we ran. But beyond the fear of individual barrages was something more profound. The realization that American artillery had become a system of war, not just a weapon. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin and chronically short of communications equipment, could not replicate the U.S. Army's integrated network. Their artillery, though often skillfully handled, lacked the coordination and speed that the FDC provided. Their forward observers could not remain on station as long or as safely as American spotters. Their ammunition stocks dwindled as the Allies enjoyed overflowing supply lines. In battles like Mortain, Saint-Lô, the Siegfried Line, and the Bulge, German commanders watched their most promising offensives collapse under the weight of American artillery. Panthers brewed up before reaching engagement range. Elite infantry companies were broken before firing a shot. Carefully prepared defenses were erased in minutes. When the war ended, analyst groups comparing casualty data discovered that over 60% of German losses on the Western Front were caused by American artillery. A stunning statistic that validated everything German POWs had said. Yet the ultimate legacy of American artillery did not lie in its kill count, but in its transformation of warfare. The principles developed in 1944, rapid fire control, centralized coordination, time on target missions, aerial observers, and adaptive fire planning, became the foundation of post-war artillery doctrine around the world. It was the first glimpse of what modern firepower would become, a merging of sensors, communications, and precision lethality. As for the German soldiers who faced it, their verdict was unanimous. An Obergefreiter from the 352nd Infantry Division put it in the simplest, clearest terms. Your artillery decided every battle. Before your tanks came, before your infantry came, the artillery had already won. And so the story ends not with a single explosion or a dramatic charge, but with a quiet truth repeated across dozens of interrogation rooms in the spring of 1945. The most feared American weapon on the Western Front did not roar like a tank or scream like a dive bomber. It whispered in radios, calculated in tents, circled overhead on fragile wings, and then reshaped the battlefield with thunder.